Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading Hellblazer number 94. But before we get into that, just a little catch up on what's been going on. We are right smack dab in the middle of the first Paul Jenkins story arc. John has been hanging out recently with his old friend Rich and his family, and they were having a good time catching up. But of course, nothing good ever happens to John or the people that hang out with him. So going on in the background, it turns out that the first of the Fallen was not killed at the end of the Garth Ennis run. He was turned into a human and he was lost to the demon world. And in Hell, one of his demon lovers named Boor, who was a demon that eats children's souls, was really missing his lover, so he went on a mission to find him, which he eventually did. And it turns out that the first of the Fallen had been a fisherman in Greece since he had been turned mortal. And when Boor found him, he told the first that he could turn the first back into a demon and also return him to his previous glory in Hell. And that all he needed to do this was the soul of John Constantine, who had done this to the first of the Fallen. And like I said, all of this was going on in the background as John was having a good time catching up with his friend Rich. So the way that Boor is going to get John's soul is he possessed Cider, the son of John's friend Rich. And Cider was going all Linda Blair from The Exorcist, and the parents were freaking out, and they asked John to help. And as John spoke to the demon inside, the demon said he wanted to do a trade, basically giving him an ultimatum saying that he wants John's soul in exchange for Cider's. And John doesn't immediately agree to that, of course. He tries to find a solution, and he's got a problem. And that problem is he doesn't know who this demon is. The demon did not reveal its true name to John, and in this kind of lore, in order to do anything against the demon, like bind it or trap it or anything, you have to know its name. So to find that out, John called in a favor from the Rainbow Serpent God from the little 2-issue story arc that happened just before this one. And the Rainbow Serpent sent this guy called Jack of the Green, who is a plant elemental who is the embodiment or protector of the British countryside, to see what John's request was. And what John wanted was into this mythical town of Abaton, which is kind of just beyond our world. It's like in another dimensional plane. It was kind of like a steampunk Victorian version of Britain. And John wanted to go here because in the town of Abaton, apparently you can find out anything you need to know. And since John needs to know who the demon is that is attacking his friend's son, he goes to Abaton and asks who that is, and he finds out that it is the demon Boor. And that is where we left off on the last issue, with John finally figuring out who this demon is. And now maybe he has an advantage, or this is just the first step in being able to defeat this demon. So first things first, with issue 94, we got the cover. We see the immortal First of the Fallen, who looks very buff, and he's lifting his hands like he's won or like he's celebrating. And the lower half of his body kind of fades into black, and then that black becomes an upside-down version of the Phantom Stranger, who's kind of like a DC Supernatural character who used to appear in the old Swamp Thing from the 70s quite a bit. And then we see behind both of them are the souls of children burning in the flames of hell. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins, with art by Sean Phillips and Pat McGowan. And we start off on the first page with John in some kind of dream. He's floating underneath the water, and as he's floating along, he sees a cup of bourbon floating just ahead of him, and there is a fishing line with a hook that is in the center of the glass along with the bourbon, so it's kind of like this thing is trying to lure John there. And over this, the narration says, "Want to know the secret of success? Don't get caught. Simple as that. I'm dancing in the current, just going with the flow. I know my river better than anyone, or so I'd like to believe. But the fact is, someone always knows more. All they need is the right bait for the right fish. An offer I can't resist." And at this, we see John swim up to the bourbon glass that has the fish hook in it, and he grabs it and takes a big swig. And of course, the fish hook goes in his mouth and catches on his cheek. And as the line pulls tight, the narration says, "I knock it back before I can think of a reason to refuse it. It's a weakness of mine, isn't it? A vague feeling emerges, a warning signal that tells me this is not my life. I hear a muffled shout and see movement in the shadows above. That's when I realize I'm back in the dream." Then John is pulled towards the surface, and as he breaches it, we see that he has been pulled by whoever's fishing to the water's edge at the beach. and also that the top of this water is set ablaze. And John's narration continues saying, "There's a cry from somewhere off in the distance. Fish on the line!" At first, I'm unable to comprehend the life outside the water, but the memories come rushing back when I break the surface. Suddenly, I know where I am and I can't breathe. So as John kind of coughs on the beach, he looks up and he sees a bunch of people who are on fire on the beach in front of him, and he knows where he is, and he says out loud, "Bloody hellfire." And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Critical Mass Part 3, The Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. So John begins to crawl towards the people burning on the beach, and there's one specific lady in front of him. She is African American, and she is looking very tormented as she writhes on the ground. And there's a child who looks like her daughter running past her in between John and the mother. And as John reaches out towards her, his narration says, "I'm back in my natural state, paralyzed on the shores of the inferno, powerless to stop the madness. Thankfully, I finally remember how to breathe. The air tastes of burning meat as it sears my tortured lungs." And then John reaches up and he removes the hook from his cheek, and his narration says, "But I'm not off the hook yet." And then the woman in front of him who's writhing looks up at him and says, "Why did you abandon the children? Why?" And John looks down at her and kind of stumbles through his answer, saying, "I didn't. I just didn't know what to do." And the woman reaches up to him and says, "They needed you, mage, to face the demon, to be their hope for salvation." And John tries to explain himself, saying, "No, I can't. He'll take my soul to hell." And then the mother grabs onto his arm and says, "But how will you live with your soul if you forsake them?" And then she falls down exhausted, possibly dead. And John answers her saying, "I don't know. I don't have all the sodding answers." And then his narration says, "But that's the crack, isn't it? There aren't any." And then in desperation, John looks up to the sky and yells, "Boor, come on out, you fucking smeghead. I know who you are now. Let's make a deal." And then Boor appears in front of him on top of a little hill, and he's holding a fishing rod, so he was the fisherman who snagged John, obviously. And he looks down at John and smiles and says, "Ha! You ran to Abaton so quickly, Constantine, that I supposed you were escaping from your fear. I see you have found my naming there. You will pay tenfold for that intrusion. Deal? There is no deal to be made. Simply this. I demand your soul in exchange for the boys, or you will live with the weight of another's damnation upon your shoulders." And as Boor is saying this, he pulls the soul of Cider out of the flames and shows it to John just to taunt him. But John, as always, starts his front. Of course, he can't show that he is scared or anything, so he yells back at Boor, "What makes you think I'm so bloody altruistic all of a sudden, you stupid shite? And what do you need me for anyway?" And then John's narration says, "That's my best defense. A bit of the old verbal. Just give the smug bastard enough rope." And as Boor cradles Cider in his arms, he looks down at John and says, "I have no need for your tired and useless soul, Constantine. We may call it a gift to one who does. This is my feeding ground. The torment of these virtuous pagans is far sweeter to me than the bland taste of your burdened spirit." And John yells back, "I don't believe you." And Boor kind of smiles and says, "Such conceit for one so damned. You only need to look inside to see the small sum total of who you are. An opportunist, a philanderer, an alcoholic." And John tries to interrupt him, saying, "Listen, you little..." But he's cut off by Boor, who finishes his sentence saying, "A murderer." And just as Boor says that, all of a sudden, the soul of Astra, the girl that John damned in Newcastle, appears next to John. And as John sees her, his narration says, "I start to protest, but that's when I notice Astra, and I realize there's nowhere I can hide. I watch her getting colder and colder, slipping away into the darkness. All I have to do is reach out and give her a spark, but I don't. And now I'm just standing in the embers." And then everything around him fades to black, And all of a sudden, a bright white light appears above him, and he looks up at it, and his narration continues. Instead of waking up, I find myself stuck in the abyss. I'm aware of another different presence here with me, and it doesn't escape me how easily this lot can find their way inside my dreams. No rest for the wicked, eh? I find myself floating through the darkness helplessly, and I'm thinking how, if God's up the other end of this tunnel, he'll be fairly surprised when my boot gets lodged up his bum. Course, that would be asking too much, wouldn't it? And then John wakes up laying on some grass in the middle of a patch of flowers, and he sees someone standing there, and he says, "Oh, it's you." And the man who he sees is the phantom stranger who's standing at the end of the little pathway that leads from this patch of grass through the darkness to another patch of grass. So John gets up and he walks towards the phantom stranger on the pathway, and the phantom stranger says to John, "Forgive my intrusion into your dream, John Constantine. I thought you might wish to talk." And in case you don't know what the phantom stranger looks like, basically he's a dude in a trench coat and a fedora, and he's wearing an all black suit. He has a light-ish complexion in his face, and he has a mask on that just covers his eyes, but the brim of his hat is always at an angle that casts a shadow that covers half of his face anyway. And he is a DC character that shows up when you need some information sometimes. He used to appear in Swamp Thing in the 70s a lot when Swamp Thing was lost and needed some kind of basic guidance. And I guess that's why he's here for John, but John is no Swamp Thing. And in fact, he gets mad as he walks closer to Phantom Stranger and he says, "Oh, what a stroke of luck. The Phantom Bloody Face Queen. What makes you think I need to talk to you?" And then he just kind of walks past the phantom stranger, and the stranger says, "Wait, your resentment is understandable, Constantine, but I was given permission by the Dream Lord to be here. He allowed me this place. Will you allow me a chance to help you before you wake?" And then John turns around kind of angry and says, "Don't bloody flatter yourself, mate. I need your help like I need an extra bollock." But then he pauses, and I guess he feels bad for what he's saying because he knows the phantom stranger is just there to help him. So he drops the act and he says, "Shit, look, sorry, all right. It's been a bad week." And the phantom stranger says, "I assume things did not go well in Abaton." Then we see a little flashback where we see John talking to the man who turned out to be Robin Hood that John talked to in Abaton. And they're both sitting at a table, and there's a bunch of empty cups in front of them like they've been drinking all night. And John is leaning on his hand like he's very distressed. And John's narration tells the phantom stranger, "Oh, you know, the usual. Got drunk with Robin Hood, found out I was going to hell, passed out in a field. A bit of a laugh, really." And the phantom stranger replies, "You should not have asked that question, Constantine." And I believe the question he's talking about is, in the last issue, when John was talking to Robin Hood, I believe he asked him where his soul was going to go when he died. And Robin Hood told him hell. So that put him in a bad mood, apparently. And in response to Phantom Stranger telling John he shouldn't have asked that question, John says, "Well, there's nothing I can do about it now, is there? I mean, what? I'm going to be punished for finding out? All this shit I've brought upon myself. Another child's being dragged into hell because of me, and I'm not even sure I should get involved." And the stranger replies, "Then you must use this to your advantage. Take the bad and turn it." But he's cut off by John, who says, "Oh, just give the bloody cryptic palaver a rest, will you? I've heard it all before. It's too late, mate. Nothing's gonna work. I'm going all to hell." And then Phantom reaches an arm out and places it on John's shoulder, and he says, "All to hell? Or just that part of you that deserves to go? Remember the demon blood." And at this, John gives a surprised smile, and he looks up at Phantom Stranger, and he says, "You clever little shite. Why? Why help me out just like that?" And as the Phantom begins to fade into the darkness, he says, "For balance, John Constantine." And then John wakes up, and he's in a grassy field surrounded by flowers. And as John starts to sit up, the afternoon sun is blocked by someone with a pitchfork saying, "You shouldn't be here." And John kind of looks around confused and says, Sorry, mate. Where is here anyway?" And the man answers, "In my bloody flower bed, that's where." So John stands up and readjusts his coat, and he looks at the ground behind him as he gets up, and there's like a full imprint of his body in the flowers. And his narration says, "Well, that's a relief, isn't it? Last time I looked, I was sleeping it off in a field outside of Abaton. Now I'm back in the smoke where I belong. And even though the situation is far from sorted, even though I'm staring down the barrel of my own damnation, there's a chance I might be able to make some small impression after all. Then we cut to Greece, where all the fishermen and everybody from the village that the First of the Fallen lives in are inside of a bar and they're having a great time. And in the middle of their great time, we see a very sulky First of the Fallen. And the narration over this section says, "They have no understanding of what is to come. The time that governs them is linear, untouchable, maddening. Patiently they wait for the end, taking comfort in any distraction that might lessen their fear of impending death. Theo tries also, but his fear is almost impossible to contain." And in case you didn't catch it in the last couple issues, Theo is the human name of the First of the Fallen. So as the First of the Fallen watches all these people drinking and having a good time, the boss of the ship that he works on is sitting next to him, and I guess he smells something bad because he says to the First of the Fallen, "Holy mother, what's that stink? Who dropped their guts?" So basically he's saying it smells like someone farted, and the First of the Fallen begins to move away from the table and he says, "Excuse me, I have to meet someone." So it makes it look like he's the one who smells because he's excusing himself after everybody noticed the smell. And as he walks away from the table, we hear them laughing at him and he looks very angry. But he walks outside and down to the beach, and as he gets there, he's by himself, but he says out loud, "I could smell your fetter from up there. Those fucking morons blamed me for it. What in hell's name are you doing? I don't think I can stand this any longer." And then a ghostly version of Boer appears in front of the First, and he says, "Patience, my love. Constantine is closer to the edge." But the First of the Fallen is not calmed by that, and he says, "Listen to me, Boer. I fell into the abyss, grew jaded on the joys of creation, before you even raised one eye from the pitch. Now I'm stuck here with a bunch of Greeks who've just discovered bloody Duran Duran. So don't tell me to be bloody patient." But Boer cuts in saying, "Oh, but your ascendancy is close, Lord, and the hated one is suffering. I can see Constantine's indecision. I watch him flounder as he wallows in his miserable integrity. I can feel the burden of his guilt tearing him apart." And as he says this, Boer gets a very creepy smile on his face, and we get a panel where this creepy face is hovering over John inside of Rich's apartment. And it looks like John is kind of struggling with something internally. And instead of just being a flashback, this is actually what's going on presently. So we cut to this, and John walks into Cider's room, where Rich is sitting on the bed reading his possessed son a story. And as John enters the doorway, Rich is saying, "He is a policeman, says Constable Blobby." And Rich is kind of concentrating because he's not the best reader, obviously. So John announces himself saying, "Oi, Rich." And Rich looks up from his book and says, "It's all right, John. I'm almost halfway through." And John replies, "Oh, Christ, no, mate. You carry on. I gotta go." And Rich asks, "What for?" And then John takes a drink out of the bottle in his hand and he says, "Listen, it's something I should have done before. Magic stuff. Weird, crazy, risky shit. No need to wake Slark, eh? Just tell her I went off to see some bloke or other. Jesus, I'm really sorry about all this, mate. I didn't see it coming. But me life recently, it's been havoc, you know?" And Rich replies to him, "Serious freak out, eh? All right, sunshine, we can handle it. It really works then, this magic shit?" And then as John coolly walks out of the room, he says, "It will, Rich. I promise." Then we cut to a public bathroom in the park that I think John was at earlier. And it's raining outside very hard. And we see muddy tracks leading into the men's side of the restroom. And inside, we see John using this mud to draw some kind of symbols on the mirror. And also, he's built up some mud in the shape of a human body in the middle of the floor. And over these panels, John's narration says, "If you fall, you might never be able to get back up again. That's the risk we all take, isn't it? I mean, at some point, for everyone, it all starts to get too much. All that baggage dragging you down. Eventually, it reaches the point of critical mass. Your legs begin to buckle under, and that's when you have to decide. Do you give in to the strain, or do you get rid of the filth once and for all?" And we can see that the symbol John is drawing on the mirror is a circle right at head height. And the circle is just big enough for his head, so it kind of looks like he's got this smaller circular mirror inside of the big rectangular mirror. So he looks at himself in this circle, and the narration continues saying, "Funny thing though, now that I've made my decision, for some reason, the burden seems lighter." And then he says to himself in the mirror, "Third bottle's always the charm." So obviously he's been drinking a lot as well. And he has a candle lit in front of the mirror, and he pours whatever's in this bottle on top of the flame, and it puts the flame out, so it must be wine that he's drinking. But the interesting thing is, the candle doesn't go out in the reflection in the mirror. And the narration continues saying, "I pour the offending liquid on my candle, washing the light away from this side. And I wonder, is this what'll eventually happen to me? This confusion, this lack of focus is understandable though. See, I'm putting my essence into hiding now and bringing my demon to the fore." So right there, we kind of get a little insight into what's going on. It seems John has created a mirror dimension to hide what he calls his essence, which I'm assuming is his good side, and then also bringing forth the demon side of him, which I'm assuming is the tainted demon blood he has. So as he does this spell, we see the mud on the ground begin to go up his legs, and you can see he looks kind of freaked out as this happens, but he continues doing the spell, and it seems like his spirit leaves him, and it goes inside of the mud circle in the mirror, and John's narration says, "Liberation is to no longer regret the past. I revel in the blessed release. I realize I've made a mistake. I've lost everything. Suddenly, I feel like laughing out loud. All the dead weight falls away. There is no way back. I'm trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea. I'm coming apart." And as the narration says this, we see John looking into the mirror and a smiling John in the reflection. Then we see the reflection John put on his trench coat, light his cigarettes, and walk out. And the real John falls backwards, passed out on the ground. And the narration says, "I say goodbye to the filth. I float back into the nightmare for one last time." Then we turn the page and we see John is back in hell. And he's in Boor's dimension because we see the hand of Boor with a knife posed over a child's body, and he's about to cut into it. And we see a long line of children standing waiting for this to happen to them as well. And then John appears next to Boor, and John says, "No, leave them alone. Please leave them alone." But Boor doesn't listen. He stabs the child and guts him, and then throws the body off the edge of a cliff into the pits of fire. And John's narration says, "I am a victim now, the bait at the end of the hook. The demon has dragged me back to witness the agony of the children I've refused to help." Then we see some children close by that are being tortured, and their bodies are being hung up by ropes on their limbs. And John's narration continues saying, "The catch of the day glistens in the sun, ripening, ready to be grilled on the fire. They are the demon's art, his masterpiece, his portrait in torment and affliction." And then we see Boor smiling in front of John, playing with his knife, and the narration says, "The artist has nothing more to say. His work speaks for itself." Then the soul of Asta appears in front of John, and she is also being held up by fish hooks embedded in her skin, connected to thin wire. And she looks at John and says, "Why did you leave us, John? It's so cold here. Why did you leave us here?" And she lunges at John, but John kicks her away and says, I didn't. There's nothing I can do for you. What do you want from me?" And then all the other children around her begin crawling towards him and begging, and then hooks come out of the sky and hook into his limbs, and he yells at the children, "What do you want from me?" And then his narration says, "But I already know what they're going to say." The noise begins quietly at first, growing in intensity like a windstorm building in the wires. It's the only song they know. So we see clouds beginning to form over John as a giant mass of children walk towards him, and his narration continues saying, "I try vainly to block it out, but Boor's pulling my strings now. The music burns like hellfire and asks me why I'm running away. It's the song of 1,000 years, a wish for sanity." Then we see a giant boar sitting cross-legged in the sky, and he is puppeting John and Astra like marionettes because the fish hooks are tied to crosses that he's holding in his hands. And the narration continues. "The demon demands my unconditional surrender. He knows he has me now. If I want to stop the music, I'll have to go to him." Then all of a sudden, a phone rings, and John wakes up, and he's in a bedroom. And as he comes to, he looks at the phone and says, Jesus. And then he answers it saying, hello? And someone on the other line says, is Alistair there? And John replies, Alistair? No, sorry, wrong number. And the man on the line says, shit, sorry, mate, I didn't mean to wake you up. And John replies, it's all right. Thanks a lot, really. And then he hangs up the phone and he kind of smiles to himself and says, and thank Alistair for me. Then he gets up and he walks into the restroom and he looks at himself in the mirror. And as he examines his face, he looks at his eyes and says, like piss holes in the snow. What the bloody hell did you do last night? Then he looks over at the toilet and there's mud all over it. And he also notices a bunch of mud all over his shirt. And his narration says, fairly bloody obvious, really. I did what I always do when I can't face myself. Got drunk as a barman's willy. Still, I can't shake this uneasy feeling at the back of my mind. And as he looks at the mud on his shirt, he kind of touches it with his hand, and it's almost like he realizes something, because as he brings his hand up to look at the mud, he has a very shocked look on his face, and he says, oh no. Oh fuck. Please no. John, you dimwit. What have you done? And then John walks out of the restroom, and as he does, he sees the phone there, and he says, Alistair. Crowley, of course. Jesus, that's insane. And then he goes over to the phone, and he picks it up, and he makes a call, and as the person answers on the line, he says, hello, is Chaz there? Well, can you give him a message for me? Yeah, it's John. You writing this down? Then we see John pick up a newspaper, and he opens it, and he folds it to a certain section, and he begins reading from it, and then he begins to put on his pants, and the person on the other end of the line is ready now for what John was going to say. And so John says, right, Ascot, 1230, number 4. Ascot, 1 out of 10. Number 21, Newberry. I know you're not a bleeding bookie. Yeah. And tell him to get a bloody move on. It's important. What? Oh, yeah, sorry, to the airport. So it seems John has given Chaz a bunch of winners for today's races so that Chaz can bet on them and then bring John the money as he picks him up on his way to the airport. Then we see John beginning to pack a suitcase, and on top of his clothes that he's just throwing in there, we're seeing him go into his closet and pull out a bunch of magical artifacts and throw them in there as well. And his narration says, suddenly, I'm racing against the clock. The room spins with an abrupt realization that I'm sitting on a keg of dynamite. This is a dangerous game I'm playing, a bluff of the highest order that only a demented or desperate man would attempt. And we see one of these items that he's pulling out of his closet is a fancy small box with a bunch of pentagrams carved into it and other magical symbols. And as he blows the dust off from it, he says, well, well, where have you been hiding? And then he throws it into his suitcase, and the narration continues saying, sounds bloody silly, really, but there truly is no going back. I've made my decision already, it seems. And one thing seems absolutely certain. And as John stares at the magical items in his luggage, he says, this one will sting like a bitch. Then we cut to sometime later as Chaz is waiting outside in the cab, and we see John come outside, and as he does, Chaz opens the door for him and says, watch it, John. How's life in the fast lane? And as John hurriedly gets in the cab, he says, don't know. Blew a bloody tire, didn't I? And then Chaz gets in the car, and as he does, he pulls out an envelope, and he kind of smiles at John as he waves it in front of him, and he says, all right, I surrender. I'm no match for your untamed wit. And John says, bollocks. You nicked that line off of Eaton Rifles. And then John takes the envelope out of Chaz's hand, and he opens it, pulls out a bunch of money, and he begins counting. And Chaz says, there's just under 2,000 in there. I kept the rest as commission. Did I mention you look bloody awful? And John kind of smiles as he counts and says, never felt better, Chaz. And then they begin to drive away, and Chaz says, yeah. I take it that fairway look in your eyes means you've got the old wanderlust again. Heathrow or Gatwick, is it? And John jokingly answers, Heathrow, Charles. And don't spare the horses. So I'm guessing this banter between them is some sort of inside joke, maybe referencing a TV show or something. And we get a bunch of panels of them driving on the freeway past a bunch of different areas of England. Some of them look like industrial areas, and some of them are countryside. And as they drive, Chaz says, I worry about you sometimes, John. I mean, you're a mate, you know? And John doesn't like this sentimental talk, so he says, I know, Chaz. Maybe when I get back this time, I'll find some bird with big tits and settle down. And Chaz doesn't appreciate this and says, very funny, forget it. And then John's narration says, poor old Chaz. I want to tell him, but I've said my fond farewells before and then come crawling back from the dead. No point in making a bleeding habit out of it. Truth is, I may not be coming back at all. Not after this date with damnation. Then as they approach the airport entrance, there's a bunch of signs over the road that Chaz is looking at, trying to figure out where to go, and he says, "There, look, domestic or international? Where are you off to?" And John says, "Oh, Scotland." And Chaz replies, "Yeah, you said that. I mean, where are you going eventually, you plonker?" And John ambiguously answers, "Good question." Like possibly even he doesn't know where he's going. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. And man, I can't wait to see what happens now that John has split himself into his good essence and bad essence. And I guess we're following his bad essence in the real world. But we'll have to wait and find out in the next issue. But until then, if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.